The neighborhood looked picture-perfect when the moving trucks arrived, with pristine lawns cut to an identical length and every driveway shining from recent power washes. The air carried that faint smell of chlorine and fertilizer, a chemical cocktail designed to maintain the illusion of suburban perfection. Each mailbox was painted the exact same shade of deep forest green, and every garden flag flapped politely in the breeze, featuring seasonal patterns that looked like they had all been purchased from the same catalog. It was, on the surface, a uniform paradise, almost too perfect, as though it had been staged for a real estate brochure rather than lived in by actual people. The house the narrator had purchased, however, stood slightly apart. Not in distance, but in principle. Its lot was carved just outside the invisible but ironclad boundary of the homeowners association that controlled every square inch of the development. The property came with no dues, no committees, no restrictions on the color of curtains or the height of grass. It was, in effect, a house-shaped loophole, grandfathered into existence before the HOA had wrapped its claws around the neighborhood. The realtor had warned about the proximity to the HOA's reach, but the freedom had been irresistible. As the first boxes were carried through the front door, a pair of sharp eyes peered from across the hedge. Curtains twitched, blinds tilted open, and within minutes, the quiet hum of lawn mowers and sprinklers seemed to pause under the weight of collective scrutiny. The residents had noticed. More importantly, she had noticed. Every HOA has its enforcer, the self-appointed guardian of uniformity, the person who treats bylaws as sacred scripture. Here, that figure was a woman known simply as Karen, though her actual name was whispered with less frequency than the title bestowed upon her by frustrated neighbors. She lived in the house directly next door, the closest property to the newly purchased one, and had spent years extending her sense of authority beyond the HOA borders. To Karen, every street lamp, fence, and flower bed in the vicinity fell under her jurisdiction, even when reality did not agree. The first encounter was not dramatic, only unsettling. Karen stood at the property line while the movers worked, arms crossed and lips pressed so tightly they seemed bloodless. She didn't speak at first, only watched, her gaze sweeping up and down the facade of the house as though measuring it against some unwritten standard. Neighbors later admitted that they had seen her do this before, hovering like a hawk whenever someone dared to change a garden gnome or park a car overnight in a driveway. By the time the sun set on that first day, whispers had already traveled down the cul-de-sac. Some neighbors welcomed the new homeowner quietly, nodding in solidarity from their porches, but never daring to cross Karen's disapproving stare. Others avoided the house entirely, fearful of being lumped into the category of rule breakers by association. It was clear that moving in next door to Karen would not be simple. The following days unfolded with an undercurrent of tension. The narrator unpacked furniture, painted walls, and settled into the freedom of a home untouched by committee rules. A hammock appeared in the backyard, strung between two old oak trees. A small vegetable garden was staked out near the fence, its uneven rows already an offense to Karen's obsession with uniformity. And most of all, the grass was cut to a comfortable height, not the precise 2.5 inches mandated by the HOA's landscaping covenant. Karen's presence was constant. She lingered near her mailbox far longer than necessary, phone in hand as though documenting each perceived violation. She paced the sidewalk with a clipboard, muttering while jotting down notes, though no official purpose existed for such surveillance. When the hammock swayed in the afternoon breeze, she stared at it from her deck, shaking her head in exaggerated disapproval. The first direct confrontation came 1 week later. It was unprovoked, abrupt, and loud enough to draw the attention of half the street. Karen marched to the edge of the driveway, gesturing wildly at the flower pots placed near the front steps. Though she shouted accusations, the words were not a polite exchange. They were proclamations. Declarations that this house did not belong, that it violated standards, that it could not stand outside the rules that she enforced. Neighbors peeked from behind curtains. A man mowing his lawn across the street killed the engine mid-row, pretending to adjust the blade while listening intently. Children on bicycles slowed to a stop, watching the spectacle with wide eyes. Karen's voice carried through the humid summer air, echoing her favorite phrase, "You can't live here." The narrator, however, remained calm. Instead of engaging, the response was silence. No compliance, no acknowledgement, simply a return to unloading the final boxes. This lack of reaction seemed to infuriate Karen more than any argument could. To her, silence was defiance, a refusal to validate her authority. She stormed back into her house, slamming the door with enough force to rattle the glass panes. From that moment, an unspoken war began. Karen escalated in small, calculated ways. Anonymous notes appeared on the door, written in block letters about violations that held no legal weight. Garbage cans were tipped over suspiciously on collection day, always the ones belonging to the narrator's property. Sprinklers from Karen's lawn mysteriously shifted angle overnight, spraying into the driveway next door with relentless precision. Still, no retaliation came. Instead, the narrator documented everything. Photos of the tipped cans, videos of Karen pacing with her clipboard, screenshots of text messages neighbors quietly forwarded in which Karen bragged about running the neighborhood. Each piece of evidence was saved, organized, and filed. The narrator knew that this would not be a short battle, but was prepared to endure it. The neighborhood woke the following morning to an unusual buzz of activity centered around Karen's driveway. Folding chairs were set up in neat rows on the sidewalk, a long folding table draped with a floral-patterned cloth, and a stack of thick binders resting at the center like holy texts. It was an impromptu HOA board gathering, summoned by Karen with less than 24 hours' notice. Word had spread quickly through the cul-de-sac via late-night texts and urgent phone calls. Attendance wasn't optional, at least not if you valued staying off Karen's bad side. By the time the meeting began, a small crowd had formed. Some brought notebooks, others arrived with weary expressions, already resigned to the ordeal. The board members sat stiffly at the table, papers neatly aligned before them, but their faces betrayed discomfort. This wasn't on the official schedule. This wasn't sanctioned. This was Karen's doing. She launched into her monologue with the energy of someone convinced they were on the front lines of a holy war. Every sentence dripped with outrage. Every gesture was theatrical, her manicured finger stabbing the air as though punctuating divine truths. The target of her tirade was obvious. She referred to the new house as the property of concern and the homeowner as the violator. She waved a binder that contained nothing more than copied bylaws, thrusting it toward the board like a weapon. The accusations were broad and absurd. She insisted the house was subject to HOA rules despite its legal exemption, claiming historical precedent gave them authority. She railed about non-standard flower pots, hammocks, and grass that flagrantly disrespected community standards. She even pointed to the vegetable garden, describing it as agricultural contamination in a residential area. Every word was delivered with conviction, though not with logic. Neighbors exchanged uneasy glances. They had seen Karen spiral before, but rarely with such intensity. Some nodded along half-heartedly, more afraid of her wrath than convinced by her argument. Others stared at the ground, unwilling to meet her gaze. The board members scribbled notes, not out of agreement, but to mask their discomfort. When Karen finally concluded, the air was heavy with silence. No one dared clap, though that seemed to be what she expected. The board president cleared his throat, reminding everyone that the property was not, in fact, within HOA jurisdiction. Karen's face hardened at the words, as if struck by betrayal. She argued back, louder, drowning out the measured tone of authority. The debate dragged on for nearly an hour, circling the same unresolvable point. In the end, the board could only reiterate their lack of control. The homeowner was outside their reach. The rules did not apply. Karen left the table with her jaw clenched and her eyes blazing, humiliated but not defeated. If anything, her resolve had deepened. By afternoon, the first of many formal complaints was filed with the county zoning office. Karen drove there herself, parking crookedly across two spaces in her haste. The staff behind the desk recognized her immediately. She was no stranger to their office. She presented her case with righteous fury, brandishing photos printed in glossy color. The hammock, The garden, the garbage cans lined neatly but differently from the rest. Each image, to her, was proof of a crime against order. The zoning officer listened patiently, then explained once again that nothing about the property violated county codes. The house was fully compliant. Karen's nostrils flared. She pressed harder, demanding inspections, invoking imaginary ordinances, insisting that exceptions must exist. Her voice carried through the office, drawing curious stares from others waiting in line. Rebuffed, but unshaken, she left with a stack of forms in her purse, complaints she intended to file regardless of their futility. To her, bureaucracy was not a barrier, but a weapon. If she flooded the system with enough accusations, someone, somewhere would eventually bend to her will. Meanwhile, across the property line, life carried on. The homeowner continued unpacking boxes, planting more vegetables, and repainting shutters a cheerful shade of blue, different from the approved HOA palette, which only deepened Karen's resentment. Every new addition was like a spark to dry tinder, igniting fresh waves of anger. The second confrontation happened 2 days later. It began with a knock at the door, not from Karen herself, but from a uniformed officer. She had called the police. The report claimed unlawful construction, potential code violations, and dangerous activity. The officer walked the property politely, quickly realizing there was nothing amiss. No infractions, no hazards, just an ordinary home with ordinary improvements. The incident, however, confirmed the escalation. Karen had moved beyond neighborly disapproval and HOA theatrics. She was now weaponizing authorities, dragging anyone she could into her crusade. Neighbors watched from porches as the patrol car pulled away, whispering about how far she was willing to go. Word spread faster than the sprinkler water that arced across manicured lawns. Stories circulated about Karen's attempts to dig through county records, her repeated calls to code enforcement, her late-night rants captured faintly through open windows. Some neighbors pitied her, others resented her, but none dared confront her directly. They had learned the hard way that standing against Karen meant months of retaliation, anonymous complaints, passive-aggressive notes, or even public shaming at HOA meetings. The homeowner, however, remained steadfast. Every encounter was documented, every incident recorded. The growing folder of evidence thickened with police visit logs, complaint copies, and photographs of Karen's intrusions. It was becoming clear that this wasn't simply an annoyance, it was harassment. Karen, oblivious or uncaring, escalated again. She rallied a group of sympathetic neighbors, convincing them that the outsider's presence threatened property values. She organized nightly patrols, where they walked the street together with flashlights, peering into yards under the guise of community safety. Their roots always lingered longest near the exempt house. Whispering loudly enough for anyone inside to hear, it became theater, a show of force. Karen at the center, leading her small troop like a general commanding soldiers. She believed visibility was power, that if the homeowner felt outnumbered, they would yield. But instead, the nightly processions were quietly filmed from behind curtains, each recording added to the growing archive. The tension in the neighborhood grew unbearable. Children played less in the cul-de-sac, parents ushering them indoors when Karen's group appeared. Conversations grew hushed, conducted in driveways rather than sidewalks. The illusion of suburban harmony was cracking, and at the heart of the fracture stood Karen, insisting she was saving the community. Her boldest move came at the end of that week. A letter, thick and official-looking, appeared in the new homeowner's mailbox. It bore the HOA's letterhead and demanded immediate compliance with community standards. Threats of fines, liens, and legal action filled the page in stern language. At first glance, it seemed authoritative, but closer inspection revealed the truth. It was forged. The HOA board had not authorized it. The language was inconsistent with real notices. The signature at the bottom belonged not to the president, but to Karen herself. It was the clearest evidence yet of her overreach, and it marked a turning point. The narrator added the forged notice to the evidence folder, recognizing its weight. This wasn't just petty harassment anymore, it was fraud. A line had been crossed. Karen, however, believed the letter would succeed. She waited, watching eagerly from her window for signs of panic or compliance. When none came, her frustration deepened. She told anyone who would listen that the homeowner was defiant and dangerous, spinning the narrative into one of community safety. To her, this wasn't about flower pots or hammocks anymore. It was about control, her control. The neighborhood teetered on the edge of open conflict. The days following the forged letter were quiet, but the silence was misleading. Beneath it pulsed a simmering tension, the kind that makes every creak of a floorboard or slam of a car door sound like the prelude to conflict. The neighbors could feel it too. They walked their dogs faster, conversations on the sidewalks became shorter, and every glance toward Karen's house carried the weight of unspoken dread. Karen herself seemed calm at first, as if she believed her fabricated notice had achieved its purpose. She strutted to her mailbox each morning with exaggerated confidence, pausing deliberately at the property line to peer at the house next door. She expected to see compliance, the hammock gone, the shutters repainted, the garden dismantled. Instead, nothing had changed. The hammock swayed lazily in the breeze, the vegetables thrived, and the shutters gleamed a cheerful blue. To Karen, it was more than defiance. It was a personal insult. By the end of the week, the calm shattered. Another envelope appeared, this one thicker than the last, and delivered not by Karen's hand, but by certified mail. The letter bore the stamp of a law office, though a quick search revealed it was a small firm specializing in estate planning, not property disputes. Still, Karen had retained them to draft a cease and desist notice filled with threatening language. It accused the homeowner of willfully disregarding established community governance and warned of pending legal action if all violations were not remedied immediately. The letter was laughably vague, citing no specific statutes or enforceable codes. Yet its intent was clear: intimidation. Karen was escalating from performative control to legal warfare. She believed the weight of official stationery would accomplish what her forged notices and patrols had not. The homeowner read the letter carefully, then slipped it into the growing evidence folder. Another piece of the puzzle, another document proving the extent of Karen's obsession. There was no panic, no visible reaction, only quiet preparation. Karen, however, misinterpreted the silence. She told neighbors she had finally cornered the violator, that the lawyers were involved now, and it was only a matter of time before the outsider was forced out. She spoke of liens and lawsuits with smug certainty, even though the HOA board had privately distanced themselves from her antics. Her voice carried across the cul-de-sac during one of her impromptu driveway gatherings, where she detailed her supposed victory to anyone too polite to walk away. But the board had grown weary. They had endured weeks of frantic emails, late-night calls, and unsolicited evidence from Karen. Each message demanded they take action, but their hands were tied. The property was not under their jurisdiction, and Karen's insistence only highlighted her obsession. Quietly, some board members began to resent her, recognizing that her behavior was eroding the community's harmony more than any hammock or garden ever could. The crack in her authority widened during the next official HOA meeting. Karen arrived early, binder in hand, ready to demand further action against the house next door. But this time the president cut her off. He reminded the attendees that the matter had been settled. The property was exempt. End of discussion. The firmness of his tone startled many, and Karen's face turned scarlet under the fluorescent lights. She tried to argue, but her words were drowned out by murmurs of agreement with the president. For the first time, her grip on the group slipped. Her reaction was swift and predictable. If the HOA board would not act, she would find another avenue. Over the following days, she inundated the county offices with fresh complaints, each more desperate than the last. She cited imaginary safety hazards, accused the homeowner of unpermitted renovations, even claimed the garden attracted vermin. Inspectors were dispatched multiple times, each visit ending in the same conclusion: no violations, no infractions, nothing amiss. The inspectors began to exchange knowing looks, weary from repeated calls clearly rooted in personal vendetta. Karen's frustration mounted with each failed attempt. She began pacing her yard at odd hours, muttering loudly enough for passers-by to hear fragments of her grievances. Her patrols grew more aggressive, with flashlights shining directly into the neighbors' windows and whispered conversations staged just outside their driveway. To Karen, this was a battle for dominance, a struggle she could not afford to lose. The neighborhood, however, was reaching a breaking point. Parents whispered about how uncomfortable their children felt under Karen's scrutiny. One resident, emboldened by the growing resentment, finally pushed back. During a morning walk, they loudly declared that Karen's behavior was harassment, not protection. Others nodded in agreement, their voices timid but present. For the first time, Karen faced open resistance. Her response was venomous. She doubled down, spinning tales about conspiracies against her and accusing anyone who disagreed of being complicit in the decline of community standards. She framed herself as a martyr, standing alone in defense of the neighborhood's integrity. But the more she spoke, the more absurd her narrative became, and the fewer allies she retained. Meanwhile, the evidence folder across the property line had grown thick enough to rival one of Karen's binders. Inside it rested the forged letter, the police reports, the cease and desist notice, and dozens of photographs and recordings. It was no longer just a defensive archive, it was ammunition. The homeowner was patient, but patience had its limits, and Karen was rapidly approaching them. The final straw came when Karen attempted to escalate beyond local channels. She mailed a packet of documents to the state attorney general's office, filled with accusations and evidence of supposed crimes committed by the homeowner. The packet included grainy photos of the hammock, copies of bylaws that did not apply, and a handwritten letter in which she described the homeowner as a threat to public safety. When news of this reached the homeowner, courtesy of a polite but bemused phone call from a state office clerk, it confirmed what had become obvious. Karen would not stop on her own. The battle was no longer about property lines or aesthetics. It was about control, obsession, and a neighbor's refusal to accept reality. The time for quiet documentation was drawing to an end. The homeowner began consulting legal professionals, exploring avenues not just for defense, but for offense. Harassment laws, fraud, defamation, each was examined carefully. The evidence folder, once a shield, was being sharpened into a sword. Across the fence, Karen continued her nightly pacing, oblivious to the storm she was conjuring. She still believed she was winning, still believed the community supported her, still believed the homeowner's silence was submission rather than strategy. She did not see the shift in her neighbors' eyes, the way they avoided her driveway gatherings, the way their whispers carried disdain rather than agreement. The cul-de-sac had grown weary of her reign. The board no longer entertained her tirades. The authorities had begun to recognize her name with exasperation, and the homeowner, silent and steady, was preparing a response that would shatter her illusion of control. The stage was set for confrontation, not the kind Karen orchestrated with forged letters and flashlight patrols, but a legal reckoning she could neither intimidate nor escape. Night fell on the neighborhood, porch lights glowing like sentinels in the dark. Karen's silhouette moved restlessly behind her curtains, scribbling, plotting, certain of her own victory. But in the house next door, the neighborhood woke to the sound of raised voices one Saturday morning, the kind that carried across yards and through thin summer air. Karen was in her driveway again, binder clutched to her chest, berating two weary HOA board members who had the misfortune of walking past on their way to the park. Her words were sharp, accusatory, filled with declarations about bylaws, community collapse, and betrayal. The board members nodded politely but refused to be drawn into another of her tirades. When they attempted to excuse themselves, Karen's voice rose to a near shriek, demanding loyalty, demanding obedience. Curtains twitched along the street. Residents peered out, whispering to each other. The spectacle was no longer entertaining. It was exhausting. Where once Karen's pronouncements carried weight, now they rang hollow. The power she had clung to for years was slipping through her fingers, but she was too consumed by her obsession to notice. Her behavior grew more erratic as the days passed. She held meetings on her porch, speaking loudly enough for the entire street to hear, even when no one attended. She paced the sidewalk at midnight, muttering about conspiracies against her. She placed fresh notes in neighbors' mailboxes, warning them of the decline spreading from the house next door, each message written in increasingly frantic handwriting. The homeowner, meanwhile, remained silent. The evidence folder grew thicker still, but outwardly life continued undisturbed. The hammock remained, the shutters gleamed, the garden flourished, and the refusal to bend became a quiet beacon to other residents who began cautiously to assert their own independence. It started small. One neighbor parked their RV in their driveway for the weekend, something Karen had always policed aggressively. Another installed a bright red door defying the HOA's muted color palette. Lawn decorations multiplied, each one a subtle act of rebellion. Karen noticed each change, of course, and her fury compounded with every gnome, every wind chime, every non-compliant detail. Her response was to escalate in public. She began staging confrontations in broad daylight, planting herself at the edge of the driveway next door and loudly declaring violations for all to hear. She listed infractions with dramatic pauses, as though reciting scripture, hoping to shame the homeowner into compliance. But each declaration was met with silence, and the silence was louder than her shouting. Neighbors watched with growing discomfort. Some filmed from behind curtains, capturing Karen's rants on their phones. Others whispered among themselves about how far she might go. The shift was undeniable. Karen was no longer feared, but pitied, her crusade resembling less a defense of order and more the unraveling of a desperate mind. The breaking point arrived at the next HOA meeting. Karen stormed in with a stack of documents, her binder bristling with sticky notes and paper clips. She demanded immediate action, demanded that the board file a lawsuit against the homeowner, demanded that fines be levied regardless of jurisdiction. Her voice grew shrill as the president calmly repeated that the property was exempt, that the HOA had no authority. When he attempted to move on to other business, Karen snapped. She slammed her binder onto the table, papers scattering across the floor. Gasps rippled through the room as she shouted accusations not only at the board but at fellow residents, calling them traitors, accusing them of siding with the violator. Her face was flushed, her hands trembling, her words spiraling into incoherence. The room fell silent. No one rushed to her defense. No one nodded in agreement. For the first time, Karen stood alone. The president, his patience frayed to its last thread, announced that her behavior was disruptive and that unless she calmed herself, she would be asked to leave. Karen's response was to storm out, slamming the door behind her so hard that the blinds rattled. The meeting continued without her, and the decision was quietly made. Karen's influence was over. The fallout spread quickly through the neighborhood. Residents spoke more openly now, their whispers turning into conversations on porches and sidewalks. They shared stories of Karen's harassment, of her midnight patrols, of her endless complaints. What had once been tolerated out of fear was now laid bare as a collective burden. The illusion of Karen's authority crumbled, but Karen herself refused to accept defeat. She returned home and redoubled her efforts, convinced that the board and the community had been corrupted, that she alone saw the truth. She plastered her windows with handwritten signs declaring the neighborhood in decline. She left stacks of flyers on doorsteps, each one railing against the homeowner next door. She called emergency meetings of her supporters, though no one attended. Her obsession grew more personal. She began standing at the property line for hours, glaring into the yard. She timed her gardening to coincide with the homeowner's presence, making a show of documenting every movement with her phone. She shouted across the fence about imagined infractions, her words carrying through the air like sirens. Neighbors began to document these meltdowns. Videos circulated quietly through group chats, showing Karen pacing with wild gestures, shouting into the void, or scribbling furiously on her clipboard while no one paid her any mind. Her reputation shifted from tyrant to spectacle, her once commanding presence reduced to neighborhood gossip, and yet, for all her unraveling, Karen was dangerous. The forged letter, the false complaints, the harassment, all of it painted a picture not just of obsession, but of potential escalation. The homeowner knew this, and the evidence folder was no longer just insurance. It was preparation for a decisive strike. The legal consultations had grown more serious. Attorneys reviewed the documentation with raised eyebrows, noting the forged HOA notice, the baseless police calls, the repeated harassment. Words like civil suit and restraining order began to circulate. The homeowner listened quietly, weighing each option, knowing that patience was nearly exhausted. Meanwhile, Karen pushed further into delusion. She began to believe she was under attack, that the homeowner had turned the entire community against her. She accused neighbors of conspiring, of spreading lies, of plotting her downfall. Her once carefully curated image of the perfect suburban enforcer collapsed into paranoid rants shouted at anyone within earshot. The tipping point came one hot afternoon when Karen staged her most dramatic confrontation yet. She marched to the edge of the driveway next door, clipboard in hand, and began reciting a list of supposed violations at the top of her lungs. She accused the homeowner of lowering property values, of endangering children, of destroying the community. Her voice cracked with rage, her words spilling into incoherence. Neighbors emerged from their homes, drawn by the noise. Phones recorded from multiple angles. Children clutched their parents' hands, wide-eyed. Karen, lost in her fury, didn't notice. She screamed until her face turned red, until her breath came in ragged gasps, until her voice broke entirely, and then silence. The crowd dispersed slowly, murmuring, shaking their heads. Karen remained at the property line, chest heaving, eyes wild. She believed she had won, that her performance had cowed the homeowner into submission. But across the fence, unseen by her, the evidence folder was being placed into a briefcase, ready for delivery. The homeowner had endured months of harassment. Forged documents, false complaints, and public meltdowns. The time for silence was over. The strike would come soon, and it would not be a rant in a driveway or a forged letter slipped into a mailbox. It would be a legal and public reckoning, one Karen could neither ignore nor control. The cul-de-sac settled into uneasy quiet as dusk fell. Porch lights flickered on, casting pools of yellow across driveways. Karen's silhouette moved restlessly behind her curtains, still pacing, still plotting. She believed she had asserted dominance once again. But in the house next door, preparations were complete. The lawsuit was filed on a Tuesday morning, quietly without spectacle. The homeowner walked into the county courthouse with a leather briefcase and left half an hour later with a stamped set of papers. Inside those papers was a formal complaint, harassment, defamation, and fraudulent misrepresentation. The forged HOA letter alone was damning, but combined with the months of video evidence, police reports, and documented meltdowns, the case was ironclad. For weeks, Karen had been telling anyone who would listen that she was preparing a lawsuit against the homeowner. But she hadn't expected the tables to turn. She hadn't expected to be served herself. When the process server appeared at her front door later that week, neighbors watched from their porches as the envelope was handed over. Karen took it with smug confidence, assuming it was confirmation of her own supposed case. Only when she tore it open on her porch did she realize the truth. Her shriek of outrage carried across the cul-de-sac. Papers fluttered from her hands as she stormed back into her house, slamming the door with such force that a decorative wreath fell to the ground. The neighbors exchanged glances. Some smirked quietly. Others shook their heads. The tide had turned and everyone could feel it. The news spread quickly. Karen was being sued, not the other way around. The details trickled out through whispers and group chats, harassment, false complaints, forged documents. The videos of her public meltdowns, once private, now circulated more widely. Screens lit up across the neighborhood with clips of Karen screaming at the property line, pacing the sidewalks with her clipboard, shouting at board members. Each video eroded what little credibility she had left. Karen, however, refused to back down. She staged another driveway gathering, binder in hand, insisting the lawsuit was frivolous, that she was the victim of a conspiracy. Her words were shrill, desperate, her once commanding tone replaced by frantic rambling. Only a handful of neighbors showed up, and even they stood at a distance, their arms crossed, their expressions skeptical. The HOA board, once her reluctant audience, now avoided her entirely. They issued a formal statement clarifying that the homeowner was not under HOA jurisdiction and that Karen's actions did not represent the association. It was the closest thing to a public disavowal they had ever released, and it landed like a hammer blow. Karen had been stripped of her crown. The court date was set for early autumn. In the weeks leading up to it, Karen spiraled further. She filed countersuits that were quickly dismissed for lack of merit. She flooded the county offices with new complaints, most of which were ignored outright. She left rambling voicemails for board members accusing them of betrayal. Her patrols grew more erratic, sometimes conducted alone in the dead of night, her flashlight beam cutting jagged lines across the sidewalk. Neighbors began to distance themselves completely. Where once her presence commanded fear, now it elicited annoyance or outright avoidance. Parents pulled their children indoors when she appeared. Conversations halted when she walked by. She was no longer the enforcer of the neighborhood. She was its cautionary tale. The homeowner, in contrast, carried on with quiet normalcy. The garden thrived, the shutters shone, and weekend barbecues filled the air with the smell of grilled food. More neighbors began stopping by, offering words of support, some even apologizing for not speaking out sooner. The silence that had once empowered Karen was breaking, replaced by small but growing acts of solidarity. On the morning of the hearing, Karen arrived at the courthouse in a flurry of indignation. She clutched her binder stuffed with loose papers, some of them flyers she had distributed in the neighborhood, others printouts of blurry photos. She wore her determination like armor, convinced she would expose the conspiracy against her. The homeowner arrived calmly, accompanied by legal counsel and carrying the evidence folder that had been months in the making. Inside were documents neatly organized and labeled. The forged notice, the cease and desist letter, copies of dismissed complaints, police visit logs, and hours of video footage. It was not just evidence. It was a narrative of Karen's obsession, laid out piece by piece. In the courtroom, the contrast was stark. Karen ranted about bylaws and community standards, waving her binder dramatically. She insisted the homeowner was dangerous, that they were destroying the neighborhood, that property values were in freefall. But when pressed for proof, all she had were accusations and irrelevant documents. The homeowner's attorney, in contrast, presented the evidence with quiet precision. Each item was introduced calmly. The forged HOA letter with Karen's own name signed at the bottom, the police reports confirming repeated baseless complaints, the videos of her public meltdowns. The courtroom murmured as the footage played, Karen screaming at the property line, clipboard in hand, face twisted with rage. Karen's protests grew frantic. She accused the videos of being edited, the letters of being fabricated. She shouted over the judge, over her own attorney, over anyone who tried to speak. The more she talked, the deeper she sank. By the end of the hearing, the outcome was inevitable. The judge ruled in favor of the homeowner, granting a restraining order against Karen and ordering her to cease all harassment. The forged letter alone was enough to warrant serious consequences, but the pattern of behavior painted a damning picture. Karen was instructed to pay damages and legal fees, a sum that made her blanch visibly in the courtroom. The neighborhood buzzed with the news that evening. The once feared enforcer of the HOA had been legally restrained. Her reign dismantled not by shouting matches or clandestine patrols, but by the quiet, patient accumulation of truth. Videos of her courtroom meltdown circulated online, shared first in local group chats and then further afield. Karen became an unwilling star of suburban infamy, her antics ridiculed far beyond the cul-de-sac. Her response was predictable. She retreated into her house, blinds drawn tight, refusing to meet anyone's gaze. She still paced occasionally, still muttered to herself in the yard, but the confrontations ceased. She had been defanged, her authority stripped by her own actions. The neighborhood breathed easier. Children played freely again in the cul-de-sac. Neighbors lingered on porches without fear of being monitored. The atmosphere shifted from one of tension to cautious relief. But though Karen's downfall was celebrated, the scars of her reign lingered. Years of intimidation could not be erased overnight. The homeowner, though victorious, carried the weight of the battle, months of harassment, the stress of false complaints, the shadow of a neighbor who had sought to destroy them. Still, victory had been won, not just for one homeowner but for the entire community. The illusion of Karen's power had been shattered. The HOA board, now free from her tyranny, began to function with more fairness. Residents felt emboldened to express individuality, planting gardens, painting doors, and reclaiming the small freedoms Karen had long suppressed. The cul-de-sac was not perfect, it never would be, but it was no longer under siege. And while Karen still lingered in her house, glaring from behind curtains, her voice no longer carried the weight it once did. She had been exposed, defeated, and contained. For the homeowner, the war was over. But the story was not finished. Karen's obsession had not vanished, it had simply been shackled. And though the neighborhood rejoiced in the calm, everyone knew that with someone like Karen, the threat of eruption always remained. The evidence folder was tucked away now, no longer needed in daily defense, but preserved just in case. It stood as a testament. The restraining order had drawn a line in the sand. For the first time in years, Karen had boundaries that were not of her own making, but imposed on her by the very system she claimed to champion. The court order meant she could no longer cross onto her neighbor's property, no longer stalk the sidewalks in the name of enforcement, no longer file endless complaints without consequence. The neighborhood exhaled, relieved to be free of her chokehold. But silence, though welcome, was never absolute with Karen. At first, her defiance was small, almost pitiful. She peered through her blinds at all hours, her silhouette flickering in the narrow slats. She left her garbage cans at the curb for days, as if daring the HOA to cite her. She taped handwritten signs in her front windows. "This community is collapsing, and property values in danger." The messages were messy, written in black marker, and neighbors treated them less like warnings and more like the ramblings of someone unraveling. Still, everyone knew Karen wasn't finished. Her last real attempt to claw back control began 2 months after the court ruling. Autumn had settled over the neighborhood, scattering leaves across lawns, softening the hard lines of manicured hedges. For most residents, it was a season of calm, a welcome reprieve after a year dominated by conflict. But Karen saw opportunity. She began gathering signatures, at least she claimed she was. Residents reported her leaving folded sheets of paper on porches, scrawled petitions accusing the HOA of corruption and the homeowner next door of being a squatter destroying property values. Most ignored them, tossing the papers straight into the trash. A few humored her, signing just to avoid confrontation, though their support was shallow and temporary. When Karen announced she was hosting a community emergency meeting in her driveway, nobody was surprised. What did surprise them was how few people showed up. Gone were the days of crowds listening to her rants. Only 3 neighbors stood awkwardly near her garage, shifting their weight as she waved her binder and shouted about conspiracies. Others watched from a distance, some even filming, knowing the footage might end up online. It was during that meeting that Karen made her final mistake. Fueled by dwindling support and growing paranoia, she crossed the property line she had been legally forbidden to breach. With her audience watching, she stormed across the lawn of the house next door, pounding on the siding, shouting accusations. The cameras caught it all. The violation of the restraining order, the frenzy in her voice, the way her neighbors recoiled in disbelief. Police arrived within minutes. Karen was still pacing, shouting at the windows, when they placed her in handcuffs. The silence that followed her removal was heavy, a mix of shock and inevitability. This time, there was no sympathetic audience, no murmurs of agreement, only relief. The arrest was not dramatic in itself, trespassing, violation of a court order, but its impact was seismic. Karen was no longer just a neighborhood nuisance. She was a legal liability. The HOA, desperate to distance itself, issued another statement disavowing her entirely. The board president even knocked on the homeowner's door personally to apologize, something no one had ever imagined happening months earlier. From that moment, Karen's downfall accelerated. She was fined heavily for violating the order, her countersuits dismissed with prejudice. Her once pristine yard grew overrun with weeds, her seasonal decorations absent for the first time in memory. The house that had once been the shining emblem of HOA enforcement now sat as a crumbling symbol of defeat. Word spread that Karen had been forced to step down from all committees, barred from attending HOA meetings, her voting privileges suspended. To a woman who had lived and breathed neighborhood control, it was the ultimate humiliation. She had not only lost her power, she had been erased from the very system she worshipped. The homeowner watched all of this unfold not with glee, but with a kind of tired disbelief. They had never asked for war, never sought to become the center of a suburban saga. Yet here they were, their simple act of buying a house outside the HOA's jurisdiction having triggered the collapse of its self-proclaimed queen. With Karen sidelined, the neighborhood changed. Slowly at first, then more boldly, residents began reclaiming their individuality. One family painted their shutters bright blue. Another installed a whimsical garden sculpture Karen would have called unsightly. A teenager parked his fixer-upper car in the driveway without fear of a citation. Where once conformity had ruled, small sparks of creativity began to appear, scattered across lawns and porches like signs of new life. The HOA itself became less oppressive, too. Without Karen hounding the board with complaints and demands, the rules softened. Fines decreased, meetings shortened, and enforcement became less about control and more about actual maintenance. For the first time in years, residents felt like they were living in a neighborhood rather than under surveillance. Karen remained inside her house, curtains drawn, a shadow at the window. Her once daily patrols ceased entirely. The few times she was spotted, she was either rushing to her car or muttering to herself in the yard, clutching her ever-present clipboard like a relic of lost power. She had become a ghost of her former self. Her reign reduced to stories whispered among neighbors and videos passed around online. And online was where her infamy spread farthest. Clips of her meltdowns, her courtroom rants, even the footage of her arrest circulated widely. She became a viral cautionary tale, the embodiment of HOA tyranny gone too far. Comment sections filled with jokes, parodies, and disbelief that someone could take suburban rules so seriously. To strangers across the internet, Karen was entertainment. To her neighbors, she was the memory of a storm finally past. For the homeowner, the journey reached its quiet conclusion on a crisp winter morning. Snow dusted the rooftops, the air calm, the street peaceful. Standing on their porch, coffee in hand, they looked across the fence at Karen's house. Once that sight had filled them with dread, the certainty of confrontation. Now it was just another house, silent, stripped of power. They thought of the evidence folder tucked away in their study, the one filled with months of documentation. It no longer felt like a shield. It felt like a record of survival, a reminder of what patience and persistence could accomplish. They didn't need to glance at it anymore. The war was over. The neighborhood had moved on, healing in small ways. Children played in the cul-de-sac again, laughter echoing where once there had been shouting. Neighbors lingered to chat at mailboxes, no longer worried about patrols or citations. Even the air felt lighter, as though the absence of constant tension had given the community space to breathe. Karen, of course, never apologized. She never admitted defeat, never acknowledged her role in her downfall. To the end, she remained convinced she had been wronged, that conspiracies and betrayals had stripped her of her rightful authority. But her words no longer carried weight. They were whispers through closed blinds, drowned out by the life of a neighborhood that had finally learned to live without her. And so the story ended not with another confrontation, and that's how Karen lost everything when she tried to control a house that wasn't even part of her HOA. What started as a nosy neighbor yelling, "You can't live here," turned into fake letters, police calls, lawsuits, and finally, her total downfall. The restraining order, the arrest, and the viral clips were the end of her so-called reign. The homeowner? They just wanted peace and quiet. Instead, they ended up exposing the truth and freeing the entire neighborhood from years of bullying. Karen thought she was untouchable, but in the end, her obsession destroyed her, while her neighbor stood strong and finally got the calm life they deserved. So what